This lecture will be the first to look at the High Renaissance in Florence and the transition to Mannerism from 1500 to 1533. As we have seen this evolution unfold, we began with the late medieval, which is going to be defined by the International Gothic style, which was elegant and courtly, and of course idealized at the outset of the century. Then we have a more attention and attentive manner paid to realism and anatomical detail, leading to what we will talk about today in this monumental approach to classicism, taking these earlier discoveries and showing that man is like God as far as being made in his image. And thus we find a new approach to monumentality and idealism again. With the crisis of faith with the Protestant Reformation, we see something happening here, and we will begin looking at that today with a few examples at Santa Annunziata, whereby we have a return to this type of elongation, attenuation, and graceful elegance, as you see off on the right here. Now, in Florence, we have no great high Renaissance architecture. This is going to take place primarily in Rome under the patronage of Julius II, who also is going to hire Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to paint the Vatican stanze. In Florence, however, we do have very influential developments in painting and sculpture that we will discuss today.
Now, Leonardo da Vinci is a very interesting artist in the sense that we would not have considered him one at the time, not a professional artist by any sense of the imagination. Now, we find that he does train rather late in life with Andrea del Verrocchio, or Andrew of the True Eye, a very popular sculptor and painter in Florence, where he learns, of course, basics in painting and then, of course, in sculpture. Now, he will invent the High Renaissance style in both panel and wall painting as well as architecture, even though his designs are not fully carried out in his own lifetime. His ideas are what are so significant. And we find that Leonardo would not have considered himself an artist, right, as we just mentioned, instead more of a natural philosopher, what we would consider a scientist, but this is before the age of the scientific method, we must understand. So we know that he makes advances in a myriad of fields, including engineering, military science, botany, anatomy, geology, geography, hydraulics, aerodynamics, and optics. Right, so we find that he does believe that science and art are interrelated, but we need to be very careful here in thinking that Leonardo's art is science. For Leonardo considered science to be a pragmatic investigation of the world, whereas art is necessarily the expression of beauty. So he does include some of his optical discoveries in his paintings, but not so much the rest of his studies. Now, he dissects over 30 bodies over the course of his lifetime, which is very interesting because few Florentine artists had actually carried out a few, let alone over 24. So dissecting the bodies, we need to be careful in stating that he does not dissect those that died having received the last rites or the extreme unction as Christians, but instead generally paid off executioners for the use of bodies that had been condemned and are outside of the grace of God. Now, thanks to his investigations, where we have one of the most accurate early circulatory systems, for instance, represented, he understands the human body more carefully and accurately, he believes, than does Michelangelo. Michelangelo, known for his beefy, hypertrophied figures. Leonardo will mock and call sacks of nuts because of how exaggerated and hypertrophied they are. Now, man, just like in the religious tradition, is considered to be the map and model of the universe being created in God's image. And here in the Vitruvian Man, we find that Leonardo illustrates the architect Vitruvius, who claimed that if you take a perfect male figure and stretch out his arms and legs, using his navel as a compass, you will inscribe a perfect circle in a perfect square, thus showing the two perfect shapes for the universe are going to be built into the body of man. Hence, of course, the circle representing the heavens or eternity, and the square representing the earth. For Plato and the Pythagoreans, these are going to be the two most perfect forms. Turning to the final work that we'll discuss today, we have a very influential yet unfinished work left abandoned by Leonardo da Vinci when he departed from Milan in 1482, having received a position to work for the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. Now, even though it is unfinished, and even though we're only looking at an imprimatura drawing or under drawing or painting, we see how influential this painting is almost immediately after he leaves in 1482. What is so different about it? Well, we have two groups of attendants, one old men and one young boy, centered around and worshiping the Christ child, receiving the gift from the elder magus as usual. The composition, which is of course still pyramidal, is going to be asymmetrical and off-axis, as we have the trees off-axis to the right, and then this crumbling ancient structure in the background to the left. Now, the underdrawing is going to be a series of dark washes that build up the shadows. In this process, showing us again that he believes dark is going to be dominant. So you find that he unites the entire scene with wash after wash of these dark shadows. The very opposite approach of earlier painters who would always begin with basic colors and highlights, adding dark shadows last. But this gives us a new unity to the painting. Also, the unity no longer is going to solely derive from the perspectival rendering. For he earlier does make a study of the shed with a crumbling structure, whereby he removes the figures to understand the perspectival grid and where to place everyone first. Then he abandons them. So we find that at the exact same time, in the exact same year, in the same city, Sandro Botticelli is making the same work we already looked at, that has the same motifs Leonardo was originally considering. So you have still the horses, right, off to the right. We have a shed. We have these ancient ruins that are crumbling off to the left as well. In the end, we find that he opts not to overtly geometricize the work, even though he studies the horses from Uccello, but instead does not use the same type of cylindrical and or geometrical construction. Instead, the horses of Leonardo da Vinci are not going to be static chess pieces. They're going to writhe, they're going to rear up, they're going to be nearly jousting and fighting with one another, which he will use again later in his very famous Battle of Anghiari. Now finally, the liveliness and vivacity that one sees in the scene unites them, not by way of linear perspective that he of course omits in the final version, opting not to make a painting like that of Botticelli. Instead, we find the figures are pushed all the way to the foreground. They are much larger in the instance that we see here than Botticelli. The ruins pushed far into the midground to the left. The horses far into the midground right, and a tree breaking the composition in two, a very different approach to compositions. Now, he does retain the pyramidal composition of that of Masaccio and early Renaissance artists, but like Pagliuolo and others, he tends to use them three-dimensionally, to where we find that the bases of the pyramid will be closer to us, the spectator, in space than the apex, the most important figure generally, in this case the head of the Madonna or Virgin Mary, instead of God the Father in the Holy Trinity. Now, because they are in a three-dimensional composition, and because they're going to relate psychologically, because they look at one another, this is a new approach in the High Renaissance that will lead to more believable and psychologically invested figures that we see relate to one another on an emotional and a psychological level, instead of merely a spatial one. So we find that we, of course, have these figures such as Saint Joseph looking over, once again, the shoulder of the Virgin Mary to the older Magus, all of the relationships between them understood. So this is a new direction in art that is immediately felt. For right after Leonardo da Vinci departs, the commission for the painting is given to another artist, Filippino Lippi, which is going to be the pupil of Botticelli. He also does not approach it the same way as his master Botticelli, but keeps the pyramidal composition, keeps the scale, the design that Leonardo had suggested. He just moves the shed back in the more traditional setting in the foreground, in the center. So this is also going to have a new set of proportions that will become dominant in the High Renaissance, and that is to state the figures now are going to be only 1/3 of the overall composition instead of nearly half in the early Renaissance. So this gives us a new monumentality and grandeur where we can put in, again, more figures into a larger architectural ensemble and to unite them in a dynamic, interrelated way. During this time, from 1499 to 1517, Leonardo is going to travel widely, traveling between Florence, Rome, Venice, and Parma, influencing these various traditions as he goes. In 1501, he returns home to Florence. Thus, we find that the instability politically that we see here in Italy represents the motivation for the High Renaissance, which is the power that Italians lack in real life. The monumentality that we find in the Last Supper meets its equivalent in a design that eventually will turn into the first High Renaissance panel painting, originally commissioned in 1501 for the high altar of Santa Annunziata, the same church where we looked at Mantegna's St. Jerome. Now, the final painting was never finished. The final cartoon, which was the design to be transferred to the painting, was also lost. But we have a copy that was going to be left on display for the public that so admired it, and artists all came from around, including Michelangelo and Raphael, copying this work. Here is the famous shrine in Santa Annunziata, right, which is still very adored today.
It is also important to note that in Santa Annunziata, this very beloved church, we also have Andrea del Castagno's vision of St. Jerome, as we see here, as he beats his chest with this rock, seeing a vision of the Holy Trinity above him, with these seraphim at the base of Christ's legs. To the right, we also have Perugino's, once again, Assumption of the Virgin in another high altar off to the left of the nave. Another very important work if you are to stop in this church.
Turning our attention to Santa Annunziata, we have a very beloved parish church in Florence, whose atrium is going to show us the evolution of art after the High Renaissance. In the atrium frescoes, we have all of the artists we will discuss today that would come to dominate Florence, both continuing the High Renaissance style, as Andrea del Sarto illustrates, and those that depart from it in the art of Pontormo and Fiorentino. Here we have Andrea del Sarto's Birth of the Virgin, which is commenting on a very famous earlier version of this subject in Florence at Santa Maria Novella. Here we have the Virgin's mother, Saint Anne, on the bed off to the right, as the nursemaids are going to wash the Virgin Mary next to this hearth at the far left. As in Domenico Ghirlandaio's Birth of the Virgin in Santa Maria Novella, we find that contemporaries are going to be dressed as though they would have during the day, shown in this image along with their biblical counterparts. The monumentality, however, moves beyond the early Renaissance version of Ghirlandaio. It references instead the Stanza dell'Adoro and the massive figures and architecture seen in Raphael's frescoes in Rome. Additionally, the proportions of 1/3 the entire ratio of the height of this work with the figures illustrates the new High Renaissance approach to proportions. However, that is not the only aspect that relates to Raphael in the work. If we look in the far background to the left, the husband of Saint Anne, Saint Joachim, is going to be in the reverse position, a mirror image reflection of Michelangelo painted in the School of Athens, or philosophy in the Stanza dell'Insegnatore. This, of course, referencing the knowledge of and accomplishments of Raphael in Rome by his younger contemporary in Florence. To demonstrate this slow evolution away from the High Renaissance, we show you the Visitation here, which at first appears to continue High Renaissance ideals, because it seems as though we have a pyramidal composition and bilateral symmetry if we cut the painting in two. However, the more closely we are going to scrutinize the composition that is arranging these figures within an arched shaped space, we notice there are some bizarre movements and coloration. First off, comparing it to Andrea del Sarto's Birth of the Virgin, we notice that the balancing elements in the foreground, especially the focalizer of the woman who's going to be off to the left of the steps, is balanced by this naked boy seated who has nothing to do with the scene to begin with, off to the side, moving our way up finally until we reach the apex of an Old Testament scene above. Now, the Visitation is traditionally celebrating the pregnancies of the Virgin Mary and her cousin St. Elizabeth, who's pregnant with St. John the Baptist. They are seen in the center. Here we have the focalizer of the image, which draws us in, as we are expecting to see a like figure on the other side balancing her out. Instead, we look to the right and find her counterbalance, her counterpoise, to be a figure of a different gender and age, in this case nude for no reason whatsoever, like in a nudity of Michelangelo. Above, we see that the coloration on the garments of the Virgin Mary and St. Elizabeth are going to very irrationally change hues and shades, just like Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Elizabeth, for instance, wears a golden tunic with a green outer sleeve and a violet inner sleeve. A very strange transition from not analogous or complementary colors, but jarring juxtapositions of those that do not complement one another. Above, we have a further odd narrative juxtaposition. So instead of comparing the sacrifice of Isaac, which most commonly is seen to foretell the crucifixion of Christ because you have a father sacrificing his son in each story, now we're comparing it as a typological association prophesying the martyrdom of Christ before he's even born in the Visitation below. A very odd choice. Here, in his fresco in the atrium of Santa Annunziata, we find the Assumption of the Virgin, the same scene painted by Andrea del Sarto we've just covered. In it, we have the figures of the apostles crowded and compressed in the foreground against the surface of this painting, so close that the drapery even comes out over it. We know that there is no landscape and no setting. We are setting it behind a stark white background without the context we've seen earlier with Andrea del Sarto. There is no shadowy area. There is no mountain. There is nothing that connects the bottom of the composition to the top. Additionally, unlike earlier images of the Assumption of the Virgin, we find that Fiorentino will show his putti linking arms to form a continuous circle that is going to be in depth, which is appropriate that the terrestrial sphere be flat and nearly square, whereas heaven is going to be a circle as described by Dante in his Paradise, a section of concentric rings surrounding God and angels singing. Above, we're going to have the same type of elaborate speeding up and out that we saw with Pontormo. It does not logically move us through the center of the image, allowing us to focus on any one example, but very spasmodically shifts us about, beginning with the bizarre focalizer at the left. Now, defying high Renaissance decorum, that being presenting things that are appropriate to the death and Assumption of the Virgin, being at a funeral, it is inappropriate, for instance, to smile. So here we have the smirking apostle to the far left that stands out. with a disturbing expression as he shows his teeth smiling, which of course is reserved only for the mentally ill at the time and or buffoons, for instance. So we find that he has a blotchy red nose, again a characteristic usually reserved for people that are inebriated and or drunk. Very inappropriate for an apostle. Above, we notice that the putti are going to be mischievous like Fiorentino's monkey. They're going to tie the girdle of the Virgin Mary into knots that are going to be teasing St. Thomas below. You can see here the pink knot that the putti has tied, teasing the original empiricist, St. Thomas, who's going to demand to put his finger in the wound of Christ's side, who's going to receive the girdle because he doubts and needs proof that she lived and was going to be taken up into heaven. Now here we have this later sketch recording the lost cartoon for the Madonna and Child with St. Anne and young John the Baptist. This would be very carefully copied by Michelangelo and Raphael, showing us this unified tonal underpainting here, much like the imprimatura painting of the Adoration of the Magi that he abandoned in 1481. So just to show you the difference between the pyramidal compositions produced earlier for works like the Madonna of the Rocks and this one is a monumental, a quantum leap forward, which shows us three overlapping figures. So three life-size figures placed in one small space. So that's why we have the unified tonal modulation now bringing these figures together. And now, instead of merely positioning them in a three-dimensional pyramidal composition, we see how they interrelate physically, emotionally, spatially in a monumental fashion. Now we know that this is interpreted immediately in a way that would be interesting to modern viewers. In 1501, the agent who was responsible for buying work for the patron Isabella d'Este writes that this group will signify the Passion, whereby St. Anne, who's going to be the older woman at the back on whose lap the Virgin Mary sits, points upward with her left hand to heaven, showing that the Passion must not be impeded, whereas the Virgin Mary, Novelera is going to interpret, is going to look down sweetly at her son, wishing he would not suffer the sacrifice that he must undertake. Now turning to the Palazzo Vecchio, in 1503, the Florentine Republic commissions Michelangelo and Leonardo to paint two battle scenes in the main greeting hall. Leonardo receives a commission for the Battle of Anghiari, commemorating the 1440 victory of the Florentines over the Milanese Duke Filippo Maria Visconti. Now we find that they are destroyed when they're covered up by the frescoes seen here in 1557 made by Vasari that we will get to. The original design, however, is going to be captured in a series of sketches because of how influential this painting was. It's changed the whole idea of what a battle painting could be. And of course, Leonardo will make dozens of sketches in preparation for this painting. He abandons the work in 1506, not surprisingly like his earlier Madonna and Child and St. Anne and the Adoration of the Magi, so only the central section is complete with a series of battling men on horseback. But artists will still come from all over Europe to copy it before it is covered up in 1556. As with the Last Supper, he makes studies of each individual figure, capturing their emotions and raw intensity as they are in the midst of furied battle and combat. The earlier studies he made with Uccello is going to certainly carry on here, but as we discussed with the Adoration of the Magi, where we have horses writhing and twisting and battling seemingly in the background, they foretell the energy and the ferocity of which these beasts are going to display during this battle scene in Anghiari. He makes several studies of the horses rearing up, twisting, always dramatically moving their head in one direction to the next, on their hind legs, rearing back, showing their teeth, right? And of course, neighing loud. So here we have the copy that is kept by Peter Paul Rubens of the Battle of Anghiari, which is one of the most complete, this type of chalk sketch with highlights and shadows. In it, you're going to have 4 horses interlocking with 4 riders, whereas 3 men fall to the ground below and are locked in mortal combat, plunging daggers into each other's necks and fighting in this way. Now, because of the engagement and the series of diagonals around which this violent action is organized, it foretells the Baroque and is perfect for Rubens, who will use it as inspiration for many of his hunting scenes. Now, in preparation, we know that Leonardo makes several studies of these figures, charging into battle, foreshortened into the scene, moving away from us at an angle as they're going to strike their opponents. Their very horses also biting and engaged with one another, just like the earlier example of the Madonna and Saint Anne. They physically overlap and interlock and engage with one another. So you find that here we have the opposite approach as seen by Uccello earlier on, and the dominant approach to battle painting, which is going to have a rather stilted chess-like approach, limiting the range of motion that figures can actually make. Now instead we have dynamically overlapping figures that will, of course, with their foreshortening and their pained expressions, right, and violent contorted expressions made individually through these studies, communicate the ferocity of this battle. Right, so the composition of overlapping diagonals and the pyramidal composition is still retained, where we are drawn into the center and the apex of these crossing swords. And we have the broad base of the man falling to the ground holding a shield in the lower left-hand corner, and the haunches of the horse in the lower right-hand corner. So we retain the same interactive, three-dimensional pyramidal composition, only now all the parts are moving, dramatically engaged, right, dynamically interacting in this way. Now, the full effect of what Michelangelo is known for, in 1504, we find that Michelangelo receives his first commission for a large-scale fresco in the Sala del Cinquecento, or the Hall of the 500, named for those individuals who would vote before we have Florence transitioning to a duchy. So this is going to be a battle scene that was commissioned from him that would be seen across from Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari. Now, he never finished the fresco, and the cartoon is lost, but it would have been seen and compared to the violent action of these men on horseback, interlocked and tangled together, threatening each other with swords, the horses biting one another, people falling down, a violent cacophony of action. Now, that is Leonardo's interest in the changing nature of the world and his interest in anatomy and in equine and male anatomy. Now, Michelangelo, however, is more interested solely in the male nude. So for his subject, he is given the Battle of Cascina. Now, the Battle of Cascina is going to be known now only from a copy and individual figure studies. This, by Aristotele da Sangallo, is going to be one of the best central sections of the overall composition. In it, we find Florentine soldiers are shown being called to action when they are surprised bathing in the Arno River. So we have this moment where he's able to demonstrate the mastery of the male nude, because we have individuals who are nude getting dressed. Thus he has an excuse to show them as such. Now, the composition is going to be taken from the earlier battle sarcophagi compositions, like the Battle of the Lapis and Centaurs, which has a series of interlocking figures that are twisting and turning and climbing on one another.
With these works by Michelangelo and Leonardo, we have a new sense of high Renaissance scaling, and this was going to be very influential for Filippino Lippi, or the Little Philip, if you will, and his scale and composition would be carried on to completion with the Adoration of the Magi, handed off to him. We see this also carried out in Santa Maria Novella, the same church where we have Masaccio's Holy Trinity. Up in the high altar, off to the right, The chapel, as you can see here in the interior nave, is up to the right of the main high altar. Here we're going to have the Strozzi chapel for the Strozzi family, their palazzo being right down the street that we looked at earlier. Here, completed between 1487 and 1502, on the verge of the High Renaissance, using the new grand monumental scale established by Leonardo da Vinci in his Adoration of the Magi, we have flanking frescoes in an all'antica or antiquarian style. Both are going to be from the life of St. John as the name of the chapel founder and the one paying for this and who would be buried here. So here we have St. John, who's raising Drusiana, one of his converts, from the dead. We can see she's on a funeral pyre being carried to be burned. But as early Christians, of course, they would bury their dead. So he is raising her from the dead to prevent her from this travesty, which would prevent her also from going to heaven. You can tell that she was dead because there's a skull actually on the funeral pyre here as well. She is pale and has a burial shroud over her. The others try to stop him as we see the sky opening up to give St. John the power to raise the dead. The structures surrounding him are ancient or all'antica, and of course reference monuments in ancient Rome. Thus, of course, we find that the new is replacing the old. Christianity is replacing paganism here. Flanking this, we have St. Philip exercising a dragon. So here we find that St. Philip raises his hand. We see God in the upper right-hand corner giving him the power to exercise this dragon who has come out of a pagan monument, this altar that a pagan priest was praying at. If we look more closely here, we see that the god of war is going to be standing with wolves that they're worshiping, with all of the armor surrounding him, showing them that they are worshiping false idols. And so the true power comes from God above. The architecture, again, is monumental and references that in ancient Rome. So we have this new vocabulary, and also these new pyramidal compositions retained throughout. This can be seen again in Fra Bartolomeo's wonderful study for St. Anne and the altarpiece of St. Anne, here in the Monastery of San Marco and their museum on the lower level. Completed between 1510 and 12, it is well within the High Renaissance. Now, if we compare it to the study by Leonardo da Vinci for the Adoration of the Magi, we can see that the composition is still going to be in a pyramid, with St. Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, at the apex, and once again, other saints forming the base of either side, with two angels or putti in the center. This seems very similar to the composition we looked at earlier by Andrea del Sarto, only now it is well balanced. It is monumental. Much like the overlapping and interlocking figures, it's influenced again by Leonardo da Vinci's composition that Fra Bartolomeo could have seen at Santa Annunziata, left on view there. Even though it was a cartoon and unfinished, this modello would be highly influential for artists. Compared to that of Filippino Lippi, we can see this interest in a new scale, which is much more monumental, is brought to bear here, and the figures being over life size in this massive altarpiece. The pyramidal composition would again be used by Raphael in his most enduring series, which are the Madonnas. This is the most popular type of painting that Raphael would produce in Florence at the turn of the Cinquecento or the 1500s. It again uses the same pyramidal composition that he would have adopted from Leonardo da Vinci. Here we have the Madonna and, of course, the Christ child to her lower left or our right, playing with a goldfinch in the hand of his cousin, St. John the Baptist. Now, the goldfinch is significant because it eats thistles, which were associated with the Passion of Christ and the crown of thorns. So we're alluding, even in his infancy here, to his crucifixion. We can see how Leonardo da Vinci had influenced Raphael and what the younger artist had taken from his older compatriot. These overlapping forms that interlock and intertwine quite rhythmically and believably in this pyramidal composition. Only what Raphael brings to the High Renaissance is this new imbued sense of vivacity and of idealized rosy-cheeked maidens and of calm background grounds, blue skies, and meadows. A much more palatable approach to these scenes that were very much appreciated by the majority or the merchant class in Florence. So next time we will continue on, so be sure to watch the documentary and take the quiz associated with it, and we will continue looking at art in the High Renaissance.